Well, US Vice President JD Vance spoke to the 2025 Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, last week. It's a gathering of conservatives, a little bit like the Forum on the Family, but a lot bigger. And he addressed his faith, his pro-life views, and using the opportunity to counsel young men. It's worth having a listen to. Let's check it out. So the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, otherwise known, is an annual political conference attended by conservative activists and officials from across the United States. CPAC is hosted by the American Conservative Union, the ACU, and first CPAC conference took place way back, 1974. Now there's also an Australian version, and I've attended a couple of those, but I'm also keen to go to the next American one. As you can imagine, this year's CPAC conference in the US was a celebratory event because the government and presidency has clearly swung from the radical left of Biden's administration to the right of Trump's administration. And as we've observed, a whole lot of common sense is being reinserted into the country, which will hopefully have a flow-down cultural effect to New Zealand, Australia, UK, Canada and other Western countries that have lost their way. But it was JD Vance's speech, or interview it was, that was most encouraging. And I want to show you just some short clips. The Daily Citizen has done a great summary of these issues on their website in the report. Now, as you watch these clips, imagine whether a New Zealand politician would ever say these things, whether they would ever present these narratives, or whether they would hide their faith and make apologies for having those ideals. Now, firstly, on the issue of who we are as male and female, just the two options, Vice President JD Vance gave advice to young men navigating our broken culture. And Vance says, our cultural message is that it wants to turn everybody, male or female, into androgynous idiots who think the same, talk the same, and act the same. But we actually think God made male and female for a purpose. Have a watch.
As young men and as young women, and we're going to help with our public policy to make it possible to do that. To young men is don't allow this broken culture to send you a message that you're a bad person because you're a man, because you like to tell a joke, because you like to have a beer with your friends, or because you're competitive. It's our message, the cultural message, and I think the president's and mine is the exact opposite, but our cultural message is, I think that it wants to turn everybody, into, whether male or female, into androgynous idiots who think the same, talk the same, and act the same. We actually think God made male and female for a purpose, and we want you guys to thrive as young men and as young women, and we're going to help with our public policy to make it possible to do that.
Yep, great statement. I mean, you hear this term toxic masculinity, but no, real masculinity is good. And it's healthy. Now, JD Vance was very open about his Christian faith, noting that Christianity is centered on the fact that the Son of God became man, he died, and then he raised himself from the dead. And he added, talked about death. He said that we shouldn't fear death. There are much more terrible things than just losing one's life. You could lose one's soul. Have a watch.
The tenet of the Christian faith. It's not just a set of good moral principles, though it is that. I think the fundamental tenet of our faith is that the Son of God became man, he died, and then he raised himself from the dead. That is the fundamental tenet of the Christian faith, and I think so much flows from that. And I think one lesson that flows from that is that we shouldn't fear death. Of course, death is a very bad thing, but there are much more terrible things than just losing one's life, and importantly, you could lose one's soul. And I think whether it's fighting for the unborn or fighting for peace and security for our citizens, I want us to be the kind of society where my kids can grow up to be virtuous young people, can be good young Christians, of course, because that's what I'm trying to raise them to be. And that's what our public policy is trying to do. Creating the space where moms and dads can raise their children in their faith to become good young people who believe the things that I do. That is what I'm trying to create, is the space for you, of course, to raise your children as you see fit, but the space for me to raise my kids to be the kind of young people that I think they ought to be. And the other thing that I take from it, Mercedes, is if you look at the long history of the Christian faith, we've been around for about 2,000 years now, give or take a few years, and there have been really dark times in the history of the Christian faith. There have been really good times in the history of the Christian faith. And I just try to remind myself that we put our faith in God above, we put our faith in the grace of God, and we try the best to do His will, and we don't worry so much about whether we're going to have earthly rewards. We worry about whether we're doing right by God Almighty above. That's what I try to do, and that's how I try to run my life in public.
Yeah, it's a pretty straight faith message, isn't it? On his Twitter account, or his X account as it's called now, you can see there, Christian, husband, dad, and then Vice President of the United States. But, you know, labels don't define a person, but Vance also walks the talk and isn't afraid of sharing or speaking up about his faith, despite his senior position in American politics. Now, abortion lobbyists hate JD Vance. They've labelled Vance as an alleged right-wing crank on abortion. Planned Parenthood Action labelled Vance as an unqualified anti-abortion politician who won't protect any of your rights. Well, he will protect the unborn child, and he protect the pregnant woman as well. Reproductive Freedom for All, which was formerly NARAL, called Vance an anti-abortion extremist who is out of step with the majority of Americans. Well, actually, he's not. But in his speech at CPAC, Vance said that we've got to persuade our fellow citizens that unborn life is worthy of protecting, that it's sacred in the eyes of God, and it should be sacred in the eyes of man too. And he talked about the fact that he wants to make it easier for young mums and dads to choose life, to start families and to bring new life into the world. He also touted the great work that pregnancy resource centres do, helping women choose life for their preborn babies. Have a watch.
The most important thing that we can do, and as you know, Mercedes, I'm very pro-life, I'm a devout Christian, is that we have got to persuade our fellow Americans, because now we've got the power. We've got the power of persuasion. We've got to persuade our fellow citizens that unborn life is worthy of protecting. It is sacred in the eyes of God, and it should be sacred in the eyes of man too. And we have to pick up the torch and fight for that every single day. And I know you guys are up for the task. I am too. And I think on the administration side, what the president has said, and it's been consistent, it's going to be consistent in the rhetoric and in the policy, is we believe in the Trump administration that babies are good, that families are good, and we want to make it easier for young moms and young dads to choose life, to start families, and to bring new life into the world. That's the whole point of our policy. Now, some of that, of course, is supporting our great crisis pregnancy centers at the moment of these important healthcare decisions, encouraging young women to choose life at that important moment of choice. Some of that is bringing costs down so that, young moms and dads don't look to the future and a new baby and say, how can I afford this? And if they're able to actually afford to raise a family, maybe they'll start thinking of babies as the blessings that we all know that they are.
Yeah.
And I think, I think fundamentally, this is going to take a lot of leadership from the president on down, but from every single person in this room. We've got to persuade our fellow citizens to stop thinking about babies as inconveniences to be discarded. We've got to start thinking of them as blessings to cherish, and that's exactly what I promise to do.
Yeah, Vance has always been a long-standing and outspoken advocate for increasing the birth rate of native-born US citizens, pointing out the political and economic problems of lower population. And he's, as you heard there, he's calling for introducing economic incentives for families to have more children, such as making births free at the point of service. That's one option, and bringing costs down. You can, as I said, you can always judge the policies and character of a person by seeing who hates them. And when Planned Parenthood hates you, that indicates that you're dead right. But look, contrast Vance's boldness on this issue with our political leaders. When Christopher Luxon, our Prime Minister, first became leader of the National Party, he was quickly under attack by the pro-abortion media for his views on abortion and the rights of the unborn child. They were rabid in their questioning. But Luxon at the time was equally unequivocal in his response.
You didn't say on the AM show this morning whether you thought that abortion is tantamount to murder. Could you clarify that? Do you
Well,
think
what I
abortion
want to
is
say,
tantamount to
no,
murder?
I'm not going to talk about it, because all I'm saying to you is I have a pro-life view. Nicola actually has a pro-choice view. The two of us actually represent views that are held by different New Zealanders, New Zealanders across the country. But the key thing is we should actually just say, we should be able to, we've got a common set of values, and fundamentally we can respect each other's position without having to make it a major issue.
Totally. But can you just answer the question whether you think abortion is tantamount to murder or not? That's a yes or no question. That should be pretty easy.
I'm a pro-life person,
So
and
yes.
That's what a pro-life position is. And so I think fundamentally, pro-life, I've got a pro-life position. I don't really want to, go into it too detailed, because the issue has been settled in the last Parliament. And I frankly would say to you, this is not an issue that has been settled, and we're moving forward, and really there are bigger issues for New Zealanders to get focused on.
Yes, but the media weren't accepting that. And so then when Roe v. Wade was overturned, and once again the mainstream media manifested, and a certain pro-life National MP was told to take down a post celebrating the rights of the unborn child being gained through that decision, even though it's a conscience decision, which means there's no specific party position on the issue. But, apparently it sent the wrong message from the National Party now. And unfortunately, our now Prime Minister made a commitment. A commitment seemed to be the only topic that he would make a commitment on, but he was vehement on this one as it relates to the killing of the unborn child.
Well, as I've been really clear about it, there'll be no change to any of our abortion laws, funding or access. I've been really clear about that. That is not our focus in government. We need to be focused on rebuilding this economy. We need to make sure we restore law and order, deliver better health and education. That is what New Zealanders want us to do. Those are the priorities for New Zealanders, and that's where our focus is as well. I want women in New Zealand to have absolute certainty that when I'm the Prime Minister of New Zealand and in a national government, that they know that our abortion laws are not going to be relitigated or revisited, that they know that funding for those health services will be maintained, and that they can be really, really sure about that.
If access to abortion is restricted in any way under your leadership, do you pledge to resign?
Yes. There's no change to abortion laws, access to funding, access to health care. Those laws have been settled. They're not changing under my government. And frankly, they're not what New Zealanders are interested in right now.
Yeah, Luxon has been desperate to guarantee New Zealanders that he will not revisit the law. Never. Ever. No other issue or law has he made that guarantee as far as I'm aware. 3 strikes, retirement age, name of the country, flag, puberty blockers. Oh, speaking of puberty blockers and chemicalising and confusing and even castrating young people, the government and Christopher Luxon has been silent on that issue. But JD Vance, he didn't speak about this issue at CPAC as far as I'm aware, but let me just remind you what great sense he makes. He's opposed experimental transgender medical intervention for minors. Of course, it's called gender-affirming care, but that just hides the true nature of such procedures. And in fact, in 2023, he introduced the Senate version of the Protect Children's Innocence Act to make interventions such as puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and transgender surgeries a felony when performed on minors. And when introducing the bill, he said, quote, "Under no circumstances should doctors be allowed to perform these gruesome, irreversible operations on underage children. With this legislation, we have an opportunity to save countless young Americans from a lifetime of suffering and regret." Now, he has also said that I'll stop calling people groomers when they stop freaking out about bills that prevent the sexualization of children. And in October, a few months after he introduced the transition-related healthcare bill, Vance introduced the Passport Sanity Act. It was a bill to ban gender markers on US passports, which the State Department had rolled out. Now, of course, with the executive order that Trump issued saying there's only two sexes, male and female, passports are all going back to biology anyway. But have a listen, finally, just have a listen to these comments from, 3 years ago. They will be music to your ears about what JD Vance says about radical things like the RSE program in schools, or the US comparative in US schools.
What I find so preposterous about this moment is that on the one hand, the Democrats are actually advocating to teach about sexuality and crazy gender theory to 7-year-old children. And on the other hand, they get offended if we throw around terms like groomer to push back against it. It's like, look, if you don't want to be called a groomer, don't try to sexualize 6 and 7-year-old children. It's really that simple. And at the end of the day, like you said, this is about parental rights. What kind of a country do we want to live in, where families control what values their children grow up in, or where Joe Biden and the pharmaceutical companies get to do that? It's pretty clear what I think 90% of Americans, what kind of country they'd like to live in.
I don't understand where the men are. Like, where are the dads? You know, some teachers pushing sex values on your third grader. Why don't you go in there and thrash the teacher? Like, this is an agent of the government pushing someone else's values on your kid about sex. Like, where's the pushback?
Well, one of the crazy things we know, Tucker, is that this is hidden from parents. I mean, I agree with you. There should be a ton of pushback. I'm a father of 3 young kids, and I would get enraged if I found out this was happening at my kids' school. But you hear all these crazy things about, 5-year-old kids go into school as boys, but then they go into the magical closet and they come out as their gender affirming identity. Of course, that has nothing to do with the crazy lunatic who's pushing them on them. Of course, we're led to believe, of course, it's all coming from 5-year-old children. So one of the things we're learning, Tucker, is that this is being forced by some of these really radical teachers, and they're hiding it from the parents. That's maybe the most pernicious part.
Yep. And that's why we're doing the investigation of the curriculum, informing parents, and then empowering them to tackle the issue in their own children's schools in a constructive but effective way. Check out our parent guide at parentguide.nz. We've heard from so many parents who have used this resource and seen positive outcome at their local school. Our politicians may be sitting on their hands, but let's not wait for our politicians to do something about these issues. We may never have an MP like JD Vance. So we need to be the voice against all this woke ideology. We need to be the ones making a stand for the unborn, the vulnerable young person, and for strong marriages and families.